Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining us today on Exegetically Speaking is Dr. Jordan Ryan, who's Assistant Professor of New Testament here at Wheaton College. He's just been here a couple of years, right?
That's right. This is my third year at Wheaton College.
Third year, and much of that has been lived under the life of COVID.
It has. At the same time, we have some really good students here, and it's been a pleasure to work with them even through some of the hardest times.
Well, today we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 18. And last time you were with us on this podcast, you talked about the book of James and an occurrence in, I think it was chapter 2, of the word synagogue, the word synagogue, where we get the word synagogue. And today we're going to put the shoe on the other foot a little bit, and we're talking about the ekklesia, the word church. Set that up for us.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm going to be looking at Matthew 18, verse 17. Now, something that I think is really important to know is that the term ekklesia, although it shows up a total of 114 times in the New Testament as a whole, only shows up twice in the Gospels, and both instances are in Matthew. Actually, I guess technically it's 3 times, but 2 of them are in one verse.
In one verse, right.
Yeah, so it's Matthew 16, 18, and then 18, 17 are the only 2 verses where it appears. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read, just to give us some context, 18, 15 through 17 in English, and then I'll point out where this word ekklesia is coming in.
Okay.
So it says this: "If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the 2 of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and as a tax collector." So the thing that I find so fascinating about this passage is that you get the word ekklesia twice in 18:17. And like I said, there are only really 3 instances of this anywhere in the Gospels, and all 3 of them are in the Gospel of Matthew. 2 of them are here.
So if this brother, this offensive brother, doesn't listen and refuses to listen to the witnesses, you tell it to the church.
Yeah.
So who's he talking about here? What is he talking about?
That's a great question. And really, I think there is some sort of like honor and shame dynamic going on here. It's this way of presenting, this person's problem to the entire congregation. And so it's now kind of making, not entirely public, but kind of at least semi-public, what's been going on. And so this kind of raises questions about what sort of institution this really is.
Yeah.
And I looked through all the major English translations, and they all translate ekklesia here as church. And indeed, there are 114 instances of ekklesia in the New Testament, and of those, 108 are translated as church.
Church, okay.
Right.
What are the others translated?
So occasionally you get the word assembly. I think that's the most common other translation. Right. And this is interesting to me because I went and did a word study of the occurrences of ekklesia in the Septuagint. So that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And what we got was 57 instances out of 75. So there's 75 instances total of ekklesia in the Septuagint, and of them, 57 are translated as assembly.
Assembly, okay.
Rather than church. And typically, it translates the word kahal, the Hebrew word, in the Hebrew Bible. And usually, in Hebrew Bible texts, that's used to refer to the assembly of the people of Israel as a whole, kind of the gathering of all the people, which is kind of interesting background for understanding how the word is used in the New Testament as well.
So does the church exist when it's not assembled?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Is the assembly the key to it? Because sometimes we think of an institution or a building or that kind of thing. as being the church. But that's not what Jesus is talking about here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, ekklesia and synagogue both mean assembly. I mean, that's the kind of basic translation of both of them. And the thing is just like how we use the word church today to refer to both the building as well as the people who gather in the building.
Right.
So too can ekklesia and synagogue, which is usually translated as synagogue. Both of those terms can be used to refer either to a building where people gather, or they can be used to refer to the people that gather within them. And the gathering in Hellenistic cities of the people is called the ekklesia, and the place where they gather is the ecclesiasterion, and there are many, many examples of those discovered in archaeological contexts.
Ah, okay. Ecclesiasterion.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. It's also, I think, just to bring it back to synagogue, ekklesia is also one of the terms used in Hellenistic Jewish texts to refer to ancient synagogues. And this is where I, as someone who's interested in the archaeological background of the New Testament, get really interested. So we find in particular in Sirach, in what for Protestants would be the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanon, for other traditions, in Sirach, ekklesia and synagogue are actually used interchangeably to refer to the public assembly of Jerusalem all throughout Sirach. So you get Sirach 4:7-9, which says, "Endear yourself to the synagogue." That's translated there assembly in most translations, but that's the word again that underlies our English word synagogue. "Bow your head low to the great, give a hearing to the poor, and return their greeting politely. Rescue the oppressed from the oppressor, and do not be hesitant in giving a verdict." So it's this clearly public institution, an assembly, a place where judgment happens, and that sort of a thing. But we also get, just to compare this, all these passages where that same sort of assembly is referred to using the word ekklesia. So Sirach 15:5, for example, says, "Wisdom will exalt the one who fears the Lord above his neighbors and will open his mouth in the midst of the ekklesia." Translated their assembly. Or 21:17, "The utterance of a sensible person is sought in the ekklesia," as opposed to a foolish person. Or 31:11, which I like. I really like this one. "The ekklesia, the assembly, will proclaim his acts of charity," which actually parallels that earlier passage where synagogue is used to refer to this institution where that exact same thing is going on. So I think that's kind of interesting. You get this parallelism between these two terms.
And how close do you think the synagogue, I mean, when you think of the Jewish, and the assembly that is related to Christ, were they fairly close in those days? Is that why we have these words that are so closely together, or the words that are different refer to the same sort of reality?
Yeah, I mean, that really gets at the heart of the question of a lot of the issues around Jewish-Christian relations in the New Testament and situating Jesus as well as the early church within Judaism.
Yeah.
It's fascinating because we have to understand that these terms have a previous life in Judaism and Jewish texts, as well as also in broader Greco-Roman society. But it raises, I think, a question for us, and that's like, so how is Matthew using ekklesia, and how's he using synagogue? Because, like, I think it's important to ask ourselves, how would Matthew's Hellenistic Jewish readers have understood this term? Because, it's easy for us to translate it as church or assembly, but I mean, how would they have understood it? And I have a hypothesis here, and I'm not the only person to have argued this, but some of my work has dealt with these two terms. There are, broadly speaking, two sorts of institutions that Matthew seems to refer to. He uses synagogue to refer to local public institutions, the village town hall or something like that, in Jewish villages and towns all throughout the Gospel of Matthew. But we get ekklesia being used in a different way. It's used as though it's kind of a semi-public institution. So obviously this passage that we're looking at, 18:17, presumes there's other people there. That's important. But it seems to be like specific to the followers of Jesus. It seems to be kind of a little bit more of an inward-facing institution.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think this fits with the two types of synagogues that scholars have been sort of able to discern in both the archaeological and in some of the Jewish texts. Because there's public synagogues, which is, basically a town hall in Jewish-controlled towns. really similar to how we see Matthew using the term synagogue.
Would that have political overtones?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was the local political gathering, the assembly of the people. So the synagogue of Capernaum would be the assembly, the gathering of the people of Capernaum. But we get this other thing, association synagogues, or kind of semi-public synagogues, which are synagogues that belong to a specific group rather than to the whole town. So I think, and as do a number of other scholars, that maybe Matthew is using these two terms as a way to differentiate these two kinds of assemblies, synagogue being the public synagogues of kind of the Jewish villages, but then he's using ekklesia, a word that has a history in Judaism for sure, using that to differentiate the sort of association of followers of Jesus who are now the sort of, he's understanding to be the assembly of the people of the kingdom, or the people of Jesus's group.
I'm persuaded. I mean, I think you made a good case here. And certainly when Paul begins thinking about the church and writing to churches, he's always writing to the ekklesia.
Yeah.
Right? The churches of Galatia, or the church of this or that. And so he uses that particular term for the specificity of those who call upon the name of the Lord and who have been sanctified through his name and that kind of things.
Right.
So there's that association, right? It's interesting to me that you were describing the fact that every Jewish village, in a sense, when people gathered, their gatherings could be called a synagogue.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily they're going there to listen to Scripture, or they're going there necessarily to pray or anything like that. But there are places of prayer described and such. But just not every time synagogue is mentioned should we think necessarily that we're looking at the gathering of the faithful of Israel in a particular place.
Right. And we could say the same thing about ekklesia in terms of how it's used in Jewish and Greco-Roman, and I mean, maybe even in Christian texts to some extent.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for being with us today, Dr. Jordan Ryan on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and Silvio Vasquez, who helped us produce this podcast. Thanks as well to John Lansma, our Wheaton-based director, who makes this podcast possible. We're grateful to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, then you need to consider Wheaton College. Whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, we have amazing programs, a first-rate faculty, and some of the best students in the world. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions about this or any of our podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions or questions about any passage in the Hebrew Bible or Greek New Testament, send us an email and we'll see if we can get one of our experts to weigh in on that for you. Our email is exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.